I know it shocks some people to find out that actually science, all capital letters of course, has on many occasions been wrong. Don't drop your teeth. I mean, it really has happened. And we've been wrong in particular about how big the universe is, how old the universe is, and there have been many false claims. And I will repeat my trite old stand that SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. Because they're not looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, they're looking for radio signals sent out with equipment compatible with what we were doing in recent years, which is about as silly as saying that, well, everybody does their scientific calculations using slide rules. I did use a slide rule when I started work in industry, and I was shocked when I spoke at a university in Detroit that when I said that in a class to illustrate how progress comes from doing things differently, nobody in the class knew what a slide rule was. It made me feel very old. Nobel Prize winners used slide rules. It was a way to make calculations, and it worked for certain things. But we have to be ready to demand as much proof from the big shots of science, as much evidence, as we demand of the people who say that they saw a saucer or an alien. There have been some people who have said, I'll believe you when you show me an alien body. You know, there are a lot of things in your life that you assume are true, even though you don't have the equivalent of an alien body or an alien craft. If you told me that you saw a 747 going over, well, why should I believe you? Give me a piece of one. That's pretty silly, isn't it? And ask guys involved in forensic activities. You can't convict somebody unless you got his DNA and it's at the scene as well? Come on. There are other ways of getting at truth, if you will. So let's first look at the size of the universe. It's big. There's Edwin Hubble. You've heard of the Hubble telescope? Well, until about 1920 or so, the assumption was there was one galaxy, the Milky Way. That was it. Big arguments took place, and Hubble did a lot of observations and was able to convince just about everybody that, you know, there's a lot of galaxies out there. And how big the universe is? Well, the Milky Way is only about 100,000 light years across. I say only. That's a huge distance, of course. But the next galaxy over is about 2 million light years across. And how many galaxies are there? Billions. Each of them with loads of stars in our own galaxy, maybe 100 billion stars, maybe 200 billion, nobody knows. It's a big number. Now, unfortunately, when the SETI cultists, as I call them, speak out, they act as if anybody is going to send a signal, it's from a long distance away. They ignore the local neighborhood. You know, we like to think in terms of hundreds or thousands or millions of light years. That's baloney. There's about 2,000 stars within 55 light years of here. That's just down the street. 2,000. And, you know, you go 10,000 or 5,000 light years and you can see how many more stars there are. It's a big, big place, and there's a lot of places in it. And we'll talk a little bit about the Betty and Barney Hill case and the star map, which I talked about yesterday. But the important point is that our position in the galaxy, we're accustomed to thinking, well, stars are several light years away, right? Anybody wants to go to another star system has got to go several light years, right? Wrong. The base stars that we're interested in there are 30 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. As I said yesterday, we're out in the boondocks. Think about it. What if there was another star so close that we could see it all day long? That would be interesting, wouldn't it? And which we could observe and spot planets about very easily. That would change our perspective, wouldn't it? So we want to thank Hubble. I know it is not appropriate for people to be smoking here, but he can smoke his pipe and I won't say anything. Whoops. I wonder if you can appreciate how much distress it caused in science when we realized that there was such a thing called nuclear fission, and that each fission event released loads of energy, far more than any chemical process. That seemed weird, impossible, incredible. And it was originally almost discovered by mistake. People were bombarding uranium with neutrons and looking at the results. And hey, what's that element doing here? And they found some elements that clearly weren't uranium plus a neutron to give you a higher atomic number element. That can't be. We must have made a mistake. It took quite a while for them to do the chemistry to find out that there's some weird stuff here. We'll call them fission products. In other words, as is often the case in science, nuclear fission was discovered by accident. They weren't looking for nuclear fission. They were looking for what happens when you absorb a neutron in a whole bunch of elements, including uranium, because it's the heaviest one. And they were looking to get elements beyond uranium, more protons. And so there was a lot of head scratching going on. How can we explain our results? This is definitely not something that's near uranium on the periodic chart. How could that be? Well, some brilliant people finally figured out that the uranium had captured a neutron and split. Seemingly impossible, but it happened. You can't deny the truth when you see it. Some great scientists were involved. And we're very fortunate that the word that there was such a thing as fission got out. It was brought to the United States by Niels Bohr, great scientist. And guys in the United States started working on it, figuring it out, and duplicating the results. So fission was on its way because of it was a mistake that somebody looked carefully at. Instead of saying, I must have made a mistake, let's go on to something else. It's like the guy who discovered penicillin. He wasn't looking for penicillin, but he saw something that didn't make any sense. And he said, what's going on here? That's the scientific method. He didn't say, if there was anything going on here, I would know about it because I'm so smart, which tends to be what the astronomers do. And then we also found right about the same time, people have been trying to explain, how does the sun produce its energy? And it was the general consensus that it was just a mass of burning gas. Lord Kelvin said that, and you figure out the mass of the sun and how much energy it emits, maybe 30 million years old. And then a physicist, not an astronomer, concocted a bunch of reactions, nuclear fusion reactions, using E equals mc squared, and came up with nuclear fusion is how the stars produce their energy. Wow. And you say, who cares? What difference does it make? A bunch of scientists meeting in a small room someplace and trying to figure out how the universe works. So what? Well, we will progress forward a little bit to see some things that happened, driven by man's desire to kill. That's a psychologically strange way to put it, but that's what it boils down to. And it is interesting how things evolved so quickly. Because we're talking 1938. Enrico Fermi came to the United States because his wife was Jewish and Hitler was persecuting Jews, and then they lived in Italy. Mussolini was persecuting Jews, so they went to get their Nobel Prize in 1938, his Nobel Prize in Oslo, went right on to the United States. So you could say he's not the only scientist like that, but Hitler drove the forces of good to take on the forces of evil by being evil himself. Hadn't thought of it quite that way before, but so Fermi came to the United States, built the first nuclear chain reaction, because the key question, which wasn't answered when they first discovered fission, was, gee whiz, when that uranium captures a neutron and divides, fissions, are any other neutrons produced? It took a while before somebody showed that there were. And then a lot of people realized, hey, that means you could have a chain reaction. Uranium fissions gives you a neutron that produces other fissions, that they produce other neutrons that produces other fissions. And you just put the numbers in. Holy cow. Look at all the energy you could get out of that. That was a thought. And first chain reacting pile, if you will, at the University of Chicago, 1942, directed by Enrico Fermi. And that was quite an event because they had a bunch of uranium and a small source of neutrons, and by putting in the right materials in the right amounts, a nuclear chain reaction took place. Now, Fermi was very careful. You don't want to have too many fissions going on. You blow the whole place up. But that got the ball rolling. So the United States spent a few $1 billion to develop the first atomic bomb. A lot of work, but you could get the money. Because at the beginning of the war, it wasn't clear that Britain, Canada, the United States wasn't in the war at the beginning, but Canada was, would be able to beat Hitler. Germans had better technology than anybody else. They built the first jet plane that was used in combat. Did a lot of other things first. So we set up a project, the Manhattan Project, in secret. Why in secret? Because we didn't want the Germans or the Japanese to know what was going on. They had just as many smart people. If they found out what we were doing, they might do it before we did. And I wouldn't be here because all the Jews in the West would have been killed by Hitler. It's not a trivial question, in other words. Do you keep it secret or do you publish it in a journal? You know, the United States, Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. Within 2 weeks, they set up a censorship office, a director of censorship. And there were certain stories that couldn't be printed, certain words that couldn't be used. One of them was uranium, believe it or not. One of them was the Japanese Fugo balloons. We didn't want them to know how successful or unsuccessful they were in launching these balloons that had bombs on board. They were off the West Coast and released the balloons, and they were supposed to start fires and destroy things all over the place. You couldn't say anything in the press about whether they were effective or not. You couldn't mention them. So there were a lot of other things. Atomic bombs was one. Even though way back in the teens, 1913 or so, somebody had used the term atomic bombs, believe it or not. Good science fiction writer. So anyway, the justification for spending several $1 billion and involving several major laboratories and thousands of people was to build an atomic bomb. The reason for doing it is we wanted to beat the Germans to it. The Germans had brilliant scientists. If we could work hard enough, fast enough, and we weren't being bombed, the United States said, let's do it. And it was so secret that when Harry Truman was a senator, he didn't know anything about the atomic bomb program. When he was elected vice president, he didn't know anything about the atomic bomb program. It was only 13 days after President Roosevelt died that the Secretary of War told Harry Truman about the Manhattan Project. And he had to make the decision, should we drop it if it's successful, and so forth and so on. That's how good the secrecy was. And it was important. We didn't want to encourage the Germans. And German scientists, there was a hidden microphone in their cell where they were being interred. When they heard about the bomb, they were shocked. The successful dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I stress this because the link between secrecy and what happens is sometimes misunderstood. We're scientists. Can't we publish everything? And our scientists will act if they don't see an article in a scientific journal. That means there's no work going on about that. I've had two people tell me that if Roswell really happened, there'd have been an article in the Physical Review, the Bible of us physicists, within weeks, examining that wreckage. And they would have had to take half the physicists out of the universities in the country to look at that stuff. Somebody told me that, and I just laughed my head off. You think that academia is the only place in which research gets done? Hardly. Los Alamos had several thousand people working there. In secret, a secret city. There were several other labs with thousands of people working to develop radar and better airplanes and all kinds of things. But your first duty is to keep it secret. So you only get the work done by people with appropriate security clearances. You don't want it published in the Physical Review because every other country receives the Physical Review. You don't want to tell your enemies because they might beat you to the punch. If they have the advantage of what you've done and what they're doing and put them together, ouch, could be a terrible trouble. So let's look at the little progression. Does the nuclear world matter? Is it really much different from chemical stuff? Well, to listen to the SETI cultists, you'd think there wasn't any difference. They talk about chemical rockets to get you to the stars. How absurd. They know better. Every astronomer knows that the stars produce their energy by nuclear fusion. Every astronomer knows that. But they still talk about chemical rockets. So we have a little progression. 1944, a big bomb releases energy at 10 tons of dynamite. 1945, the first fission device tested in New Mexico released the energy of 15,000 tons of TNT. From 10 to 15,000 in 1 year. That's a big jump. Our first hydrogen bomb, nuclear fusion device, tested in 1952, released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. So we go from 10 to 15,000 to 10 million. Those are big jumps. It's not just a little bit more energetic. The Russians tested a big one, really big one. 57 million tons of TNT. That's the amount of energy released there was. The fireball on our 10 million ton one was 3 miles wide. Think of that for a minute. 3 miles. That's just the fireball. That's a lot of energy. Now, why do I mention all this stuff? Because it's quite obvious that every advanced civilization will ask the question, how does its star produce its energy? And that once you understand its nuclear fusion, and unless you think we're so much smarter than everybody else that nobody got there before we did. I mean, come on. The planet's only 4 billion years old. 1938, we understood. Tested in 1952. You mean nobody got there before we did because we're so smart? What an ego. And so the point here is not just that we know how to make bigger bombs, but we know processes that produce an enormous amount of energy, and that those processes can be used to go to other stars. It makes a big difference. I mean, when my grandparents crossed the Atlantic in the early 1900s, what it takes 5 or 6 weeks to cross the ocean, something like that. And now we have satellites that go across, and well, they go around the planet in under 100 minutes. Times have changed enormously. We want to go to the stars. There's probably 20 different ways of doing that, but we know that fission and fusion will do the job. And that makes us part of a neighborhood. And that means if we know how to get out there, somebody else out there knows how to get here. It's no big deal. Because you can't duplicate it doesn't mean that it can't be done. It means you're not as smart as the other guy. Now that's something we don't want to admit, of course. So we need to change our perception. Also, the Kepler demonstrated, with the advantages of very advanced electronics, that that little device can make extremely accurate measurements. What are we talking about? How do you find out there's a planet out there? Well, when the planet goes in front of its star, it reduces the light we receive from that star by a very tiny amount. Think of a butterfly going in front of a headlight from a car a mile away. And you could tell when that butterfly goes in front of the headlight. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. And Kepler makes repeated measurements, and if you make them enough of them, you can see how long it takes the planet to go around the star. And you can find out that there may be 5, 6, 8 planets going around that star. Some of them are close, some of them are far, but you suddenly realize that, boy, there's an awful lot of planets out there. A really huge number. And Frank Drake of the SETI community estimated a few years back there might be as many as 8,000 places in the galaxy that could be sending us signals. He didn't answer the question why they would send us signals and why he thought they would use technology that's similar to what we were using at that time. You know, are they sending AM or FM? You think they're still using the same techniques we were? I doubt it very much. Maybe 8,000 places, wow. And now a good bet is 8 billion. This doesn't mean they all have civilizations. Now, another thought. Most people living in Canada, their great-great-great-great-grandparents didn't live in Canada. We have the First Nations people, but most of the other people, somebody migrated here. Somebody colonized here. So just because there may have been a planet that had nobody on it 1 million years ago doesn't mean there's nobody on it now. And you see, you have to understand that every advanced civilization is going to worry about what happens if there's a catastrophe here. A supernova goes off. An asteroid makes a big mess of the planet. I mean, after all, we had dinosaurs for a long period of time. Ain't around no more. Something happened to them. So civilizations have to worry about colonization and migration. let's hope they recognize that they can't overpopulate a planet before they use up their resources. We're getting close to that point. And maybe there ought to be some controls on how rapidly you grow and how much resources you use. But you're going to be looking around the neighborhood. We may be somebody's colony. As I often say, we may be a penal colony. They dump the bad boys and girls here, and that's a good explanation for why we're so nasty to each other, why we don't like each other. Hey, Australia, they're proud of their convict heritage. I was surprised. They really get a kick out of it. England dumped the debtor prisons into Australia, and they're not ashamed of it. I don't know how many debtors were sent to Canada. That's an interesting question. Okay. So, nuclear fusion is a way to produce one heck of a lot of energy from a small amount of material. And one of the nice things is you're using hydrogen. And what's the most abundant and lightest element in the universe? Hydrogen. Wherever you go, there's going to be hydrogen. Not so true for uranium. That's heavy, but you don't find it everywhere. And I know somebody asked me about this yesterday. What did you mean when you said that the Earth was the densest planet in the solar system? You talking about people? Dense people? No. A cubic meter of Earth weighs more than a cubic meter of any other planet in the solar system. They're not all alike. We're the champs. We're the densest. So what? That means we got more valuable, weird stuff like osmium and rhenium and uranium and tungsten. Much heavier than lead, all this stuff. So who cares? Well, people who want exotic materials with special properties. We're using a lot of materials now we didn't use 100 years ago. The nuclear navy, for example, is entirely dependent on zirconium alloys. Whoever heard anything about zirconium? Maybe zircon, like diamonds, that sort of stuff. A whole new technology had to be developed because zirconium just happens to have the right properties, high temperature melting points, resistance to corrosion, and very low neutron capture cross-section. So if you use zirconium, it doesn't take as much uranium in the reactor for the nuclear navy. That's what started all this stuff. Titanium, SR-71, loaded with titanium. You don't see much stuff being done with titanium. It's gaining as we have developed the technology. But so who knows? Osmium was in the news recently when this guy was arrested, served 5 months in prison. Osmium tetraoxide or something like that. Osmium is the densest element, twice as dense as lead. And osmium, I think it's sexoxide, is poisonous too. That was in the news. They just released the guy from prison because they decided he really wasn't a threat. They'd only kept him there 5 months. Strange world we live in. It's probably the only time you ever heard of osmium in your life. Okay. So we have to understand that there are some differences here. And there may be osmium miners out there. Whoops. Okay, there's fusion. Helium is the second lightest gas. I showed this yesterday. And that top line, what's important is 18 MeV, million electron volts per reaction. Burning stuff, chemical rockets, etc., maybe 10 electron volts per reaction. So we're in a whole new world here, entirely different. If we want to go to the stars, we know we could use nuclear fusion if somebody wanted to spend the money. That's what it takes. Research and development programs are large and expensive, sometimes fail, often fail. Sometimes they turn up good stuff. I don't mean just bombs. jet engines, things like that. So you pick the right process, so you get charged particles. Why is that? One guy, Dr. Krauss, said, well, fusion would be interesting, but there's no way you can get all the particles to go out in one direction. Of course there is. You use the reactions that produce charged particles and not neutrons. They are given off in all directions. That's not much use if you want to go that way and kick the particles out the back that way. And charged particles will do it. They're born that way. Different world. Yeah, 10 billion times as much energy per pound as in chemical combustion. So not just a little better. That's the point about the Kepler. Lots and lots of planets. Some of them close to other planets and around other stars. Airlines set their traffic up on going to real places. They don't go out and say, where are we going to go today, guys? Presumably, aliens are smart enough to aim their rockets to stop at places that are interesting to them. Now, incidentally, we don't know what's on the backside of the moon very much. There could be other bases around some of the other planets in our solar system. You know, gas, food, lodging, next exit. Not unreasonable. So my great-grandchild will grow up with people knowing that there are billions of planets out there, probably knowing that some of the inhabitants of some of those planets are coming here. There are a few people in government who know that now. Some of you who take UFOs seriously know that as well. Now there's Frank Drake. He's the guy who says maybe 8,000 places. Dr. Jill Tarter. Frank once said there might be somebody as close as 1,000 light years, and she said when we make contact with them, it'll be one of the great days in our history, and they may help us solve our problems. And I thought about that. Now, wait a minute. We're going to send a signal out that says, help! What can we do for you? It takes 1,000 light years for the signal to get out to a place 1,000 light years away, and another 1,000 for the answer to come back. That's not going to be much help. You know, if you got a little pressure on you, global warming, call it whatever you want, a war that killed a lot of people, a disease, pestilence, an asteroid, waiting 2,000 years for an answer is not very useful. And why would they help us anyway? Oh, there's Lord Rees, yes. The English Astronomers Royal, whatever the plural of Astronomer Royals is, have a sorry history. In 1956, the English Astronomer Royal said, in Time magazine no less, that space travel is utter bilge. What we really need is better equipment for astronomy. Well, that was less than 2 years before Sputnik went up. And what field of science has benefited the most from the space program? Astronomy. Look at all those satellites up there, not only Hubble and Kepler and Chandra, and there's a bunch more. They really help us in our everyday life. We take for granted communication satellites. A station broadcasts to a satellite, it sends the signal back down. Saves a lot of energy. Can spread the signal where you want it. Weather prediction. It may not be perfect. Nature isn't entirely predictable, but it certainly is nice for the people living where there are hurricanes and cyclones and stuff like that to have a pretty good prediction of the weather. Unfortunately, they were right this past year, and we had the worst winter in 35 years that I've lived in Fredericton. But at least we knew that it was there, and we knew what was coming and how many more feet of snow were going to fall and stuff like that. Satellites are useful. Now, dear Lord Rees, in the tradition of Astronomer Royals, said a couple years back, 3 years now, only kooks see UFOs. Why would anybody come here just to talk to a bunch of kooks? What evidence did he present? None. What reference did he give? None. Does he know anything about the subject? Obviously not. I think he's thinking that if aliens were coming here, they'd want to talk to him. Well, I mean, the Astronomer Royal, who else would you go to? Of course, I don't think astronomers have much to say about what happens on the planet, do you? I don't think so. It was a stupid thing to say. Because there are at least 3 books that have lots of sightings by astronomers in them, written by astronomers. Obviously, he hadn't read any of them. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. That's the credo here. So, the times are changing. 3 good books. Dr. Peter Sturrock from Stanford, Dr. J. Allen Hynek from Northwestern, and there's a 3rd book, which name escapes me at the moment, with sightings by astronomers. Not uncommon. They don't like to admit it in public, of course. All these surveys were done very quietly, you know. That's the thing that keeps back progress in ufology. The fear of ridicule. And I've had a number of people tell me, well, you must get a hard time. You come on very strong. You say flying saucers are real. You say there's a cosmic Watergate. Don't they beat up on you? No, they don't. 11 hecklers, 2 of whom were drunk, in over 700 lectures. 1 nasty newspaper article. The others weren't all 100% accurate, but they weren't unpleasant. They weren't hypercritical, if you will. It's okay to speak up, and I say that to encourage people to report their sightings, because you might encourage somebody who has an even better one to come forward. Everybody's afraid of ridicule. One professor did a survey of a class that I was going to visit. 80% of the kids in the class thought most people didn't believe in UFOs. But he also asked what they thought. 80% of them did believe in UFOs. This is before I even got on campus. But as long as people think other people think this is a ridiculous subject, they will behave because they want to keep a low profile. Don't be so fearful of ridicule, for goodness sakes. If you can't stand the heat, Harry Truman said, get out of the kitchen. If you know what you saw was something unconventional, then don't be afraid to say so. And if you were in the military and had a good observation with radar from an airplane or stuff like that, call me. I'm in the phone book in Fredericton. Talk to a MUFON member, etc. There's Seth Shostak and I debated. We were friendly toward each other on the QE2, and we both had a free trip from England to New York, sponsored by the British UFO Magazine. And we each listened to the other one give 3 lectures. I asked in the course of my lecture how many people had read each of the 5 major studies that I talked about. Seth hadn't read any of them. Not surprising. We debated on coast to coast. I won 57-33-10. He did say 6 months later that he had a copy of my book. I'd called him to see if I could send him one, and I did, Flying Saucers in Science. And he mentioned that he had it on his nightstand. He didn't say he'd read it. It's got a whole chapter on the cult of SETI. I wouldn't want to have been too close when he read it to see what he might say. I liked him. I'd love to take him on again, but I would bet anything he wouldn't take me on again, because he'd have to do some homework this time. Now, the age of the universe is another interesting thing. Bishop Ussher went through the Bible in 1643, looking at all the begats. A sex fiend, you might say, but anyway. And he concluded that the world was created in 4004 BC. I think it was on a Thursday, but anyway. And so that's been the standard for the fundamentalists. Everything was created 4004 BC. Grand Canyon, God made it look as if it was created a long time ago. Dinosaurs, that's ridiculous. You don't see any running around now, do you? This is kind of the attitude. So the age of the universe is very much a sore point. And I've met people who are still convinced that it was created 6,000 years ago. And, you know, we have data from civilizations older than that. And you got to look for it. I'm a fan of Heinrich Schliemann, who figured out where Troy was by reading the Iliad, and was rich enough to hire people to dig down a place in Turkey. 75 feet, and they found Troy. But of course, before that, the historians all knew that there wasn't any Troy. That's just a myth. If there was, we would have known about it. You know, like we have daily newspapers from Troy or something like that. You know, give me the microfilm, let me check. How much of the planet do you think we've explored 75 feet down? Damn little is what I would say. Okay, here's some of the sources of evidence. On the left, the biggest study ever done, Project Blue Book Special Report 14. Information on only 3,201 sightings. The work was done by Battelle Memorial Institute under Air Force contract. They found that 21.5% of the cases couldn't be explained, completely separated from the 9.3% for which there was insufficient information. They did a cross comparison between unknowns and knowns. The probability of the unknowns or just misknowns is less than 1%. Now, none of that was released, of course, at the time. They put out a press release in which they lied. I hope that doesn't surprise anybody. I've always liked this cartoon. The cop says to the guy, "What are you doing?" "I'm looking for my keys." "Well, where'd you lose them?" "Well, over by my car down the road there." "Why are you looking here? There's more light here." That's the radio astronomy approach, you know. Pretty silly. This whole question of secrecy. Now, why would you expect an astronomer to have any knowledge about secrecy? Astronomers take great pride. They publish their results. If they find a signal from aliens, they'll have it in the paper the next day. What's this nonsense about governments keeping secrets? Of course, we forget the fact that who owns the big radar sets? The government. The satellites? The government. Maybe it isn't so easy to get data. But Seth said the proof that governments can't keep secrets is what a lousy job FEMA, Emergency Measures Association, did when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. And look at how we know what a lousy job the post office does. Obviously, the government can't keep secrets. Dr. Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I love his remark. I think it's such a good line. The proof that the government can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. That's pretty funny when you stop to think about it, because it's so absurd. Hasn't he heard about the NSA? Of course, it really means never says anything or no such agency, so maybe he hasn't heard about it. Or the CIA or the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office? He doesn't think they can keep secrets? Just an example, the Washington Post says the intelligence budget for military intelligence in the United States 2 years ago was $52 billion. That's a lot of secrets. That's CIA, NSA, and NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. They're the guys who were looking down at everything. $52 billion goes a pretty long way in financing people and stuff instead of feeding starving kids. But governments can't keep secrets. How utterly ridiculous. How many people here have had a security clearance? Just raise your hand. I just want to count. I'm not looking for names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only 6. I'm surprised. And me makes 7. Okay. 8. Okay. A few anyway. Everywhere I go. Sometimes there are more, sometimes there are less. Depends on age and all that sort of stuff. And I think all the guys who've had clearances know that secrets can be kept. And you don't spill about the secrets you know to the local reporter. And you don't tell your spouse. Other things like that. There's a real world, in other words, and astronomers aren't in it when it comes to secret keeping. The Manhattan Project, several $billion. First atomic bomb. Even General Groves' wife didn't know what he was doing for the 2 years that he was directing that project. She found out when it was announced on the radio that the project to develop the atomic bomb, which had just been dropped on Hiroshima, was under the direction of General Leslie Groves. That's when she found out what he was doing. Stealth aircraft. We only spent $10 billion. Now, who knows what the most advanced model looks like, but we use it in warfare, incidentally. For those who think the Germans developed all these saucers, I cannot believe that if Hitler's people knew how to build a flying saucer, that they wouldn't have used them in the war. And don't tell me, well, Hitler was really a nice guy. He didn't want to hurt anybody. I don't believe it. And somebody did try to say that on the radio the other day, I'm told. Another example, I used to drive a Toyota Corona, and there's a town in New Mexico near where the crash actually occurred. The Roswell crash was Corona. But there was also a spy satellite. And the first 12 launches were all failures, not a word in public. It was to replace the U-2 because the U-2 violated international law. I mean, who cares? But, you know, when we found out the Russians could shoot one down, that's when we cared. Anyway, the first 12 Corona launches were failures. The next one got more data than all the U-2 spy planes had obtained about the Soviet Union. Helped protect the peace because they didn't have nearly as many military installations as we thought they did. We were gearing up, building more bombs, more planes, et cetera, et cetera. And then we realized, hey, they haven't built anywhere near as much as we thought they had. We can relax a little bit. We informed the public about the Corona spy satellite like 30 years after the first one went up. And there were lots of them. Can't keep secrets. Now, what I get a real kick out of is the people who say, there are people in ufology who've said this, there's no cover-up of UFO data. There's loads of it out there. Well, if you look a little harder, this is a typical CIA UFO document, top secret Umbra. And I can give you dozens of documents like this. I think you can read 8 words on this one. Well, maybe it's 6. I don't know, something like that. My favorite is the NSA, though, National Security Agency. I've got 156 pages that look like this. 1 line per page can be read. Everything else is whited out, not blacked out. And the reason they whited it out is because I used to show one of their documents, which was blacked out, on television and turn the pages. See how much information they released? Get a good laugh. And when I called the NSA because I heard about they were releasing a new batch of documents, when I told the gal my name to give her my address to send me a set, oh, I know who you are. That got me concerned a little bit. Why does the NSA know who I am? Well, Mr. Philip Klass, the noisy negativist, debunker, had told him that I showed this blacked out document on television, and people laughed, and they shouldn't put out any more like that. They should put out whited out documents. So they did that. I still get as many laughs, incidentally. Can't keep secrets. I had people in ufology call me, Stan, they're not keeping the secrets anymore. Why do you say that? Well, they've just released 156 top secret Umbra UFO documents. I said, well, can you read what's underneath the whiteout? Well, no. Well, they're not releasing information. I mean, isn't that proof? Top secret Umbra. The big CIA UFO report, the Robertson panel, from many years ago. It wasn't top secret, it was only secret. There's a famous memo from General Twining. It wasn't top secret, it was only secret. You can't put top secret material in a secret document, because the people who get it don't have a need to know for top secret, most of them. That's the way the game is played. I think that's a very exciting document, because it proves the point that they're covering up. One of my favorite and most important documents, the Bolender memo. General Carol Bolender, an Air Force general, engineer working on the lunar excursion module, he was asked, what the heck should we do about Project Blue Book, which was ostensibly the only government group concerned with UFOs. This is back in 1968. 1969, that time frame. And he had no axe to grind. He did a study, published a memo, classified, which we didn't see until 10 years later. Reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system, he said. And he said, if we cancel Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report sightings. However, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. It means the Air Force has been lying since that year. The Blue Book was closed as a result of his memo. I talked to him 10 years later. He agreed there were two separate communication channels for those things that could affect national security and run-of-the-mill stuff. I haven't found anybody else who talked to him. He's dead now, so I don't know how to reach him. Well, maybe some people here do. I don't know. I think it's an extraordinarily important memo, and this leads up to my presentation tomorrow about Operation Majestic 12, because you have to say, well, okay, if Blue Book didn't get the reports that could affect national security, where did they go? And I think they went to Operation Majestic 12, whose name has been changed because the name has been publicized. That's standard practice. If you have a code name for a project and it's secret or top secret and it gets out in public, then you have to change it. That's required. So tomorrow we'll be talking about Majestic 12. But the Bolender memo is real. Came from the government. I talked to the man. He was who he says he was. He really was an Air Force general. And he agreed that there were two separate communication channels. And which is of more interest to government? The reports that could affect national security have to be much more intriguing, important. I mean, you have to worry. What if the aliens join with the Russians or the Chinese? You want to know about that. I've heard 7 stories of airplanes being shot out of the sky by UFOs that the airplanes were trying to shoot down. If I've heard 7 stories, there are a lot more than that out there. Those are matters of national security. when your pilots get shot out of the sky. Okay. The basic rule again is technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Our world is ruled by microelectronics. There's a famous law, Moore's Law. The number of transistors you can put on a chip doubles every year or two. This has been going on since the 60s. That's why we have very tiny things that can do big amounts of work. Look at today's computers. I mean, you can carry around that little portable computer up there, 3 terabytes. Think about that. You got kilobytes and megabytes, and what's the next one? Gigabytes, and then terabytes. If you had told somebody that 50 years ago, that you could carry this around, in your car, in your briefcase, they'd have laughed their heads off. How utterly absurd. Look how much heat those vacuum tubes would need. Well, we don't use vacuum tubes anymore for those computers. When I started working in industry, we'd fill out input data sheets calculating radiation shielding information, dose rates. And you'd fill out input data sheets. A girl would, and it was always girls, key punch them in IBM cards. They'd carry a box of these cards and a big reel of tape up to a mile-away facility that had loads of air conditioning there, because those super-fast computers, IBM 701s, required an enormous amount of air conditioning to take the heat away from all those vacuum tubes. And, who was it? Somebody said that you'd never need more than, 64 megabytes in a computer? Something like that. Well, times have changed. My great-grandson has more computing power than that big computer that we used at GE. The times, they have changed. And the more computing power you have, the more objectives you can obtain. And the more you do that, the more you can do other things. And it's kind of nice to know what you're doing by being able to do calculations in a hurry. Lots of them. Lots of data. The world has changed a great deal. Now, the bottom question on this, how can ET be stuck at the level of Marconi? Now, I'm a proud Canadian. I've been to Newfoundland and see where Marconi's signal was first received, the first transatlantic, long-distance radio communication. And it is something to be proud of. And there were all kinds of people who told Marconi, you're crazy. Don't you understand the Earth is round and radio signals travel in straight lines? And so you don't go very far before the signal runs into the Earth. Well, Marconi was a very clever guy, and he had run tests with ships great increasing distance and was getting results that indicated, no, that line of sight wasn't the limitation. And you know what? We didn't find out why radio signals could go long distance until years later. The reason was very straightforward. There was a layer of the atmosphere, the ionosphere, that reflected radio waves. We didn't even know it was there. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. I'm not saying every new crazy idea is going to be important or real or turn out to be right. But I'm saying a lot of them are. And that's where most progress comes from. It's not only with regard to UFOs or technology or bombs. There's a story in my book, Science Was Wrong, about a doctor who couldn't understand in Vienna at a big lying-in hospital. Finally, women were going to the hospital to deliver babies. And 20% of the women who were treated by doctors, residents, interns, call them what you want, developed childbed fever and died. Only 3% of the women treated by midwives died. It's a long story, it's in the book, but the important thing that he found is something so obvious you'll wonder about it, but he found that they weren't washing their hands between doing autopsies upstairs and delivering babies downstairs. He instituted strict cleaning measures, brushes on the hands, strong soaps, etc. Cut the number down to 3%. And his reward was being fired because the boss of the hospital says, we don't do things that way around here. Thousands of women and their babies died because of that wrong information. But it was expressed by a man in authority. That's what matters. The big shot has spoken. The astronomer royal of baby deliveries. There's a lesson here, is what I'm trying to say. It is interesting that the record for going around the planet was set by Magellan's ship back in 1523. Took 3 years. He didn't make it, but his ship did. 3 years. That's a reasonable amount of time. And of course, we got Jules Verne, Captain Nemo, and so forth. 80 days. Around the world in 80 days. Wow, from 3 years to 80 days. And the International Space Station does it in between 90 and 100 minutes. But the International Space Station is not just a bigger ship. Progress comes from doing things differently, and it hasn't stopped. And you can reverse this. Aliens, seeing what progress we have made at being destructive, would be very concerned about us going out there, wouldn't they? Who let the idiots out of the cage? On the left, you can see part of a slide rule, for those of you who don't know what I meant when I talked about slide rules. You can buy pocket calculators for much less than I paid for my slide rules, I'll tell you. And they can do one heck of a lot more. It's not just a small slide rule. Entirely different. Oh, on the left, a typical nuclear rocket engine. The big one's 4,000 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, the one on the left. On the right, I worked for Westinghouse on this one, only 1,100 megawatts. A lot of energy in a small package. These were tested back in the 60s. Here's my book. Oh, I got to show you a cartoon. Oh, there's the data. I showed it yesterday. 21.5% of the sightings couldn't be explained. Secretary of the Air Force said 3%. What's a little factor of 7 or so? The quality evaluation, the better the quality, the more likely to be unexplainable. Just the opposite of what the debunkers try to tell you. Oh, Carl Sagan. The reliable cases are uninteresting and the interesting cases are unreliable. Unfortunately, there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. You just saw the more reliable the case, the more interesting. But why let the facts get in the way of a pronouncement? Oh, I love this quote. Simon Newcomb. He was Canadian, incidentally, in his early development. The demonstration that no possible combination of known substances, known forms of machinery, and known forms of force can be united in a practical machine by which man shall fly long distances through the air seems to this writer as complete as it is possible for the demonstration of any physical fact to be. And his title was, that article was A New Look at the Cosmos. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. What did he know about aviation? Damn little is all I can say. And you notice how he used the word known there. As if we know all there is to be known, right? We're such smart people. He was such an important astronomer that President Taft attended his funeral. I mean, that's a measure of some kind of importance. Oh, the Navy. I love talking about the Navy because when I was a kid, my brother liked the Army and I liked the Navy, and there was an Army-Navy football game every year. And on the left, a nuclear submarine can go around the world underwater without coming to the surface. They take periscope leave to look at the islands that they go by. On the right, one of my favorite ships, that's a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. There are a number of them. They carry about 75 little airplanes, and they can operate for 18 years without refueling. 18 years. No gas stations. That's incredible. It changes everything in terms of sea warfare, because you used to have to be concerned about if I go too fast for a while, I'm going to run out of fuel, and there aren't any places to get more fuel out here because the enemy is making it hard for me, etc., etc. Can steam at full power for years. But it also illustrates something else. You got a big mothership and some small, I'll call them Earth excursion modules. You can call them jet airplanes if you want. They can fly for 2 hours without refueling. The mothership, 18 years. So if you want to get from another star to the solar system, go nuclear. It's funny. If you're going to travel, you look at where airplanes fly, because you know they don't take off randomly. You know, where should we go today? Well, I'll throw a dart at a map and see which place I'm going to land in. You know, you can't work that way, because airplanes take landing strips and, you know, control systems and so forth. This is a map of air traffic. It is not random. You can see that there's certain places you can fly from other places, and some places you can't fly from other places. Don't you think the aliens are not going to go? What star system shall we go for today, folks? Come on. I showed this yesterday about the star map with the Betty and Barney Hill case. And again, I would reemphasize the base stars are only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. And they're only 39 light years from here. So don't talk to me about intergalactic. Who cares? If my wife needs a loaf of bread for dinner, I don't say I'll be back next week because I got to go down to Australia where there's a great bakery. The superstore is down 2 miles away. We need it for dinner, honey. The point is, people are brighter than the SETI cultists give us credit for, if you will. There's Betty and Barney Hill. The stories in the book captured. Oh. Susan Clancy is a PhD from Harvard. She says there are no abductions. Sleep paralysis, that's what it is. She wrote a whole book. She got everything wrong about a case that happened in Maine. 10 years off in the date, the number of people involved. Detail after detail was flat out wrong. Don't they have a fact checker at Harvard which published the book? I mean, it's the kind of nonsense you got to put up with, but you have to expose whenever you have the opportunity. The basic rule should be have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. Here's my book about Majestic 12, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow. There's Mr. Class, big debunker. Never went to the Eisenhower Library, but he was talking about what their documents aren't like. Paid me $1,000 for proving him wrong. Well, he said one of the documents that I turned up on MJ12 was done in the large pica type, but sorry, he said, the National Security Council used only elite type, and he had 9 documents to prove it. Of course, the Eisenhower Library has 250,000 NSC documents, and he offered me $100 each for every genuine document meeting certain criteria, up to a maximum of 10, unfortunately. I was going there, so I grabbed 14, they're easy to spot, made copies, sent him an invoice for $1,000. He unfortunately had a limit of 10, and he paid me. Didn't tell anybody about paying me. Got very angry when I published a copy of his check in a report I wrote. Threatened to sue me. I told him that, look, Phil, you sent me the check. They cashed it at the bank. I had Xeroxed it first. I can do whatever I darn please with the Xerox, thank you. And he shut up. But there is no Friedman file in his papers at the American Philosophical Society Library, even though we communicated for 20 years. I don't think he wanted people to know about paying me. There's the Betty and Barney Hill story. There's Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, who was the primary author on Captured. We're working on another book. Crash at Corona, the story of the Roswell Incident. Oh, one of my favorite explanations from the Air Force. Crash test dummies. That's what they found at Roswell. That's why those stories. And I talked to the man on the right, the dummies in the middle. I should point out a few facts. No dummies were dropped until 6 years after Roswell. The dummies were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. I am sure no rancher finding such a dummy, usually with an arm or a leg off because they're made out of wood and they're dropped out of airplanes at, 40 or balloons 40,000 feet or so, is going to say, my God, an invasion of aliens. I mean, and the clothes do matter. Well, because of the heating of the bodies, the temperature, and the drag. So it's not we want them to look official. It's practical. I talked to the man on the right, Colonel Madsen. I just like time travel for 6 years. I think that's pretty neat. And the Roswell report, somebody else showed a copy of this, the cover. That's the crash test dummy explanation, which is absolutely absurd, but was taken straight by the New York Times. Air Force has spoken. They wouldn't lie to us, would they? You're damn right they would, and they have over and over again. Oh, there's another crash story. There's a new edition of this book that'll be out later this year. That's Aztec, New Mexico. Scott and Suzanne Ramsey did one enormous amount of research. This thing crashed in March of 1948. Big one. And Scott even hired a guy to figure out, could you possibly move that to Los Alamos? Aztec is in the northwest corner. And the story was from people that it had been taken to Los Alamos. Hired somebody who was not a believer in UFOs, but who specialized in figuring out whether you could move huge power plant equipment, big generators and stuff like that. You got to worry about roads and bridges and, choke points and all that sort of stuff. And they went over the maps and so forth, and he concluded, indeed, you could take it over to Los Alamos. This is a guy who didn't believe in flying saucers, but they did one heck of a lot of research. And I would recommend the book. I wrote one of the forwards, I guess, for it. Well, I think it's clear. Man's not at the top of the heap, mankind. We're a threat to the neighborhood, and we're a primitive society primarily involved in tribal warfare. I think that's a pretty fair explanation for who we are. I'm sad to say that. Thanks for listening. Oh, I have to show you the cartoon. This was in the St. John, New Brunswick paper after they wrote an article saying that I had been voted into the Roswell Hall of Fame. Always nice to be recognized by your peers. Anyway, thank you very much.